So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining our spring edition of the SpenglerFox webinar series. Just for some housekeeping in advance, we will be recording today's session and make this available to anyone from our community who wishes to listen in at a later stage. Also, the session will be followed by a Q&A in which we invite you all to ask any questions, which you can do so in raising your hand virtually within the control panel on the right. So allow me to kick off today with a brief introduction of myself. My name is Jens Friedrich. I'm the CEO of the SpenglerFox Group. Having been raised in exotic places like Kenya, Indonesia, Kuwait, and Switzerland, I returned to Germany, where I now live with my wife and 3 daughters, but typically share my time between, well, what I call home and various other locations in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and obviously other parts of this world. I have meanwhile been in the search industry for about 25 years and joined SpenglerFox in 2010. SpenglerFox is an international, fully retained executive search and leadership advisory firm that offers senior permanent and interim staffing, as well as talent mapping, on-site and board solutions to our clients across the globe. Our roots are strongly developed in the emerging markets or growth markets and supported by our own strategic alliances group. Our services are available and offered across the globe. SpenglerFox was acquired by its own management team approximately 2 years ago, which today provides us with additional opportunity to develop both our geographical reach and our service portfolio. As we regularly connect with our communities to share experience and discuss market trends or various topical issues, I'm delighted that we've managed to retain Deborah Hicks Midanek as a guest speaker on today's call. So before I hand over, let me share with you some key milestones in Deborah's career so far. So Deborah is a pioneer in corporate restructuring and a serial entrepreneur who has successfully supported the transition of over 60 corporates and facilitated the growth of nearly 30 ventures. She's directly been involved in the extraordinary innovation that has taken place on Wall Street over the past decades and comes with solid knowledge of the capital markets. Deborah has served as CEO and sat on boards of both public and private companies, and her success stories go far beyond that. Deborah is also a writer and regular speaker on governance, strategy, leadership, and resilience, and is the author of The Governance Revolution, in which she provides invaluable insights to today's board members. But she's also recently written an article on dispelling board myths, which I would love you to share with us today, Deborah. So Deborah, welcome to the call, and thank you so much for being our guest.
And thank you so much, Jens. It's such a pleasure. And you left out of your discussion of the many places you have lived your sojourn in Ireland, because I find it so entertaining that a German national native speaker speaks English with an Irish accent.
Thank you very much. And I heard that before I ever stepped into the country of Ireland. So it must be something from my heritage. But Deborah, would you fill out any of the gaps that I may have failed to mention within your remarkable career, and maybe update us on some of your recent projects?
Yeah, that's funny. Well, I am an inveterate fixer of things and places and situations, and I just can't help myself. So in my latest iteration, in addition to writing this book and serving as a corporate director of several companies, I have purchased 20 dilapidated 19th century buildings around a community square in north central Mississippi, which sounds unspeakably exotic, right? So I am in between board meetings and writing. I am renovating and creating magnet tenants and renting out these spaces. So I actually spend my spare time running my restaurant.
That is amazing.
Well, the truth is I have a lot of fun, and writing this book was a lot of fun. So how do you want to proceed, Jens? Do you want me to work through these myths, or did you want to ask me questions about them?
Well, why don't we find a good solid mid ground to kick it off? So why don't we start in perhaps giving us some information, Deborah, about what actually prompted you to write this book?
Thank you for that opportunity. I took a seat on my first board of directors in 1990. And it was a very complex and extremely vitriolic situation in which, for some reason, I was motivated to organize the shareholders of the company and to fight with the bankruptcy court in the United States to get the shareholders recognition in the bankruptcy. And that company was Drexel Burnham Lambert Inc., whom some of you on the call may remember was a fairly infamous company almost 30 years ago. And since that time, I have served a number of other boards, and I've also served as the troubleshooter, problem solver for companies in distress, and so on. And a great many of the issues that I have encountered could have been avoided had the board of directors had a more lively sense of what their actual job is. Well-intentioned people working hard, but not really aware of their job. So for 30 years, this book had been percolating in the back of my mind when the opportunity to write it, provided by a German publishing firm called De Gruyter, dropped in my lap. And of course, I was terrified as to how I was going to write a book, but I sat down and I wrote it straight out of my head in 4 months. It was the most extraordinary thing. And I think it was just that it was percolating there for 30 years.
Mm-hmm. And could you share a little bit about obviously your experience and what you're sharing with us within this book?
Well, when I started writing it, Jens, the title was The Art of Governance. And I thought it was going to be a gentle book, trying not to yell at directors, but leading them into an understanding of the nature of their job. But when I was halfway through it, I said to the publisher, I said, wow, there is so much going on in the world of governance now that I think we are actually in the middle of something that I would call the governance revolution. I think we ought to change the title. And so we did change the title. And what do I mean by the governance revolution? There is a tremendous amount of, let's call it agitation right now on the part of many different parties outside of the boardroom as to what the board of directors should be doing. Regulators across the globe are bringing more and more different pressures to bear. We look at Wells Fargo a year and a half ago. It was unprecedented that the Federal Reserve Board would get involved in structuring the board of directors of a company and in making them cease and desist from any further growth until they had cleaned up their corporate governance. And they took one more step, which was to write letters to the former chairman, chastising them in public for their very poor performance. So regulators are bringing a lot more pressure. Legislators are bringing pressure. In the US, Senator Elizabeth Warren has brought her accountable capitalism legislation, which would require that the business be reconstructed as a social enterprise. There are initiatives around the world about the composition of the board, insisting on further participation by women and minorities. There are, of course, shareholder activists continuing to behave in very strange ways, to my mind, in insisting on their own initiatives being adopted by boards. There are large institutional investors grading through their proxy advisors the performance of boards of directors. So there's an enormous maelstrom right now of pressure on the board. And I do believe that many boards of directors living in their somewhat cloistered environment are somewhat unaware of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How would you, in going a little bit deeper into that, Deborah, how would you actually describe the the purpose of the board of directors and how their success can be evaluated.
Well, you've gone right to the heart of things, Jens, as is typical, I think, of you. But again, when I started writing this book, I did what probably anyone on this call would do and say, okay, where was the first board of directors? And where did this whole idea of this group of people at the top of the corporation come from? So it didn't take me long to think to myself, okay, it had to do with ships, right? It's got to be explorers going out there around the globe, figuring out what the globe was comprised of. And that was true. As far as I could tell, it was 1602 in the Dutch Republic that the first limited liability corporation was formed, in which the various ship owners came together at the behest of the Dutch Republic government to pool their resources to develop a company that could compete with the Portuguese in the spice trade. And the carrot for them for doing that was that in addition to the minor non-management shareholders having limited liability, the government was willing to offer the managing shareholders limited liability so that the limit of their loss was the amount they had invested. And this group came together with permanent capital, raised 10 times more capital than anyone else at the time, and proceeded through the Dutch East India Company to dominate the seas for quite some decades. And as an interesting aside, since the capital had to stay in there permanently, according to the government, they needed a secondary market if somebody needed the money. So they created the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, which listed the securities of exactly one company for the first few years of its life. So there was a secondary market in these securities, which was pretty interesting. So the board concept that was used then, I think, was borrowed from the long-running guild structure as a way of making those shipholders feel that they were included in governance decisions. And the Dutch East India Company had the Lords 17 as their governing body, which had different geographic representations, essentially. So it was a borrowed concept, this idea of the board. But now, and forever after, in the 400 years between then and now, the formation of a corporation anywhere in the world requires that the affairs of that corporation be supervised by a board of directors, which is generally required to include more than one person. So to me, it is very clear that the board supervises the affairs of the corporation. The board is the ultimate authority, and the fiduciary duty of the board is owed not to the shareholders, but to the entity, to the corporate entity that they're serving. The idea for that is that a corporation under the law is deemed to be a person. It has the legal rights of a person. It can enter into contracts, it can own property, it can bring suit, but it doesn't have any arms and legs or any brain. So the board of directors is the arms and legs and the brain of the corporation, not management. And of course, in some models around the globe, there's recognition of that. For example, in Germany, with the difference between the management board and the supervisory board. Those roles and responsibilities are somewhat clearer in that structure. In what's known as the unitary board or the single board entity, it's not so clear. So it's very possible to get confused.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. And why do you think, Deborah, also from the timing of you publishing and writing the book, why is thinking about the board of directors and the revolution, as you call it, so important today?
Well, I guess I'd say several reasons for that, Jens. And I didn't actually address one part of your prior question, which is, how do we know when the board is successful? And that's a very difficult one. But we sort of know when the board is not successful. And we can trace the history of thinking about governance largely through a whole series of corporate failures. One of the failures that was extremely influential in 1970 was what's known colloquially as the wreck of the Penn Central, which was incredibly shocking at the time and had the same kind of impact that the Enron failure did in 2001. So we have these waves of corporate failures, which seem to continually elucidate the fact that the board of directors somehow or other was not alert to its job. So that continuing spate of failures has brought more and more focus to the mechanism of the board. So I think for that reason, it's very important to actually focus on what the job is and how to do the job effectively so that we can reduce the incidence of those failures. That's the narrow answer. The bigger answer is a really interesting one in that I was stunned to read information from the World Economic Forum that only 500 corporations in this world control approximately 70% of world gross domestic product.
Wow.
And that's just a stunning number. And the corollary to that is that investors have become so large that it's only a dozen or maybe 20 at the max that own the majority of the shares of those companies. So on the one hand, this is an enormous opportunity, sort of like what the world was like when these companies were private, because these institutional investors really have nowhere else to take their money. They're so big, they have to invest in these big corporations. So they have to engage with the board of directors to determine that their investment dollars are being protected by that board. And the board of directors, on the other hand, has a huge amount of power. Let's look at those 500 corporations and realize that they have more potential to affect the future of the world than do most governments. I don't want to be too controversial here, but where I'm sitting, government power is somewhat compromised by the world of the internet and the horizontal communication across many different populations, where we have old government models in sovereign states and new behaviors from the citizens of the companies. So the corporations are in the position where they have more flexibility than governments to figure out what the new world is going to look like. So to me, getting the governance of those companies straight and making sure that it's done properly, thoughtfully, and with proper regard to all of the different constituencies at the table is an absolute imperative right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Deborah, before we move away from the book or close the topic on the book, is there anything else in regards to the content? Any other main points that you'd like to bring out to the listeners that we haven't, let's say, touched upon, to let's say do a teaser on the content of the book, because it does sound very compelling.
Well, the effort to write the book was really quite fascinating, and about 2/3 of the way through, I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm actually going to write down the fact that the shareholders of the public company are not the owners of the public company. Mm-hmm. I'm going to take a lot of flack for that. And so I called a Delaware attorney friend of mine, Delaware being sort of a bellwether state as far as interpreting corporate statutes in the US, and said, you know, Lewis, I need to run this by you. I need you to read this because I have gotten so immersed in it that I fully believe that what I'm saying is true, but I need someone who understands the law to tell me whether I'm all wet. And he said, you know, a couple of weeks ago, I would have said, you're out of your mind. But the truth is, I just went to a continuing legal education forum in which the Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court was a speaker. And he said the same thing. He said exactly the same thing. So I was set back on my heels and had to sit and think about that for a while. So Deb, I think you're on the right track. It's a controversial book. And the second book that I'm working on right now is, of course, it's the governance revolution in action. What do the stakeholders say around the table? In other words, what do the institutional investors say? What do the hedge funds say? What do the academics and the regulators and the legislators say? In fact, what do employees and management say about the board? Because you will find it's amazing, but there is relatively little unanimity about what the job of the board actually is. And dealing with that confusion makes it very difficult to be an effective board member.
Mm-hmm. So basically, you're following up with a second book. Obviously, seeing it from the perspective of the board member itself, and perhaps giving some guidance in regards to what the do's and the don'ts are for this group of people.
Actually, it's a little different from that, Jens. It's that I am going to be interviewing regulators, long-term passive investors, activist investors, legislators, about what their views are of the board. People outside the boardroom have become so noisy that I want to collect all those, not all of them, collect representative views in one place to see if we can find common ground, you know, to develop the kind of clarity that is really needed about who does what to whom and why. Shareholder activists, for example, tend to erupt in the boardroom, asserting all kinds of rights that they don't have. And the board is intimidated enough by their extraordinary rudeness that they don't fight back, which is just remarkable to me.
Yeah, given the group of people they are, that's true. Excellent. Deborah, in my introduction, I mentioned also you recently wrote an article on dispelling board myths, which of course is complementary to the content here. Would you share with us some of your elaborations on that?
Sure. The first one is the one I mentioned a moment ago, which is that there is a general belief that public corporations are owned by their shareholders, when in fact in the EU, first in 1948 in the UK, and then reaffirmed by the EU in 2015, shareholders of public companies do not own them, but instead they own interests in residual income with specific and narrow rights attached. And of course, those rights include the right to elect the directors. The EU directive says that the rights of shareholders are similar to the rights of creditors. They are contractual rights. And if you think about it for a while, you realize that in buying and selling shares of a company, you're not actually engaging with the company. Unless you're buying in an IPO, you're buying on the secondary market, and you're buying based on the prospects of the earnings of that company. What you're looking for is a return on your capital. You're not looking to be involved in actually organizing the affairs of the company. So I found it to be very clear once I read the fact that, oh yes, I understand that. That's right. Public companies are not owned by their shareholders. The next one, and it's fuzzier, but I believe very strongly that the myth that the board owes its loyalty to the shareholders is just flat out wrong. And that if we continue with that view, we are hurting those shareholders. Of course, we want to be generating attractive returns for those shareholders, or we should all go home. However, the board owes its loyalty to the corporation, and through the maintenance of that corporation as a healthy, profitable, sustainable, long-term enterprise, it generates a return for the shareholder. This is actually, at least in the US and I believe around the world, it is actually the law that the board represents the company, not the shareholders. But in 1970, a schism developed following that wreck of the Penn Central that was led by Milton Friedman and by Jensen and Meckling. They developed a theory that the board was the agent of the shareholders and able to represent the shareholders when the shareholders could not be present. That is known as the shareholder primacy theory. And those very same people are now walking back on that, saying, nope, that's a problem. So it gets us to the third goal myth, where how many times have you heard that what's the goal of the board? Oh, it's to maximize shareholder value. That to me is extremely pernicious. It's a conversation stopper. It means people stop thinking, because if you actually think about what it means to maximize shareholder value, you realize it's impossible. What standard do you use to maximize? Which shareholders are you trying to maximize value for? And what is your determinant of value? So that is a sufficiently imprecise label that what it does is make everyone default to thinking about the current stock price as the indication of maximizing shareholder value, which is an extremely short-term view and can be actually seen as a dereliction of fiduciary duty, because you can look at that as saying that you're sacrificing the creation of long-term value. Okay, number 4, independent directors are not necessary. Now, this is an interesting piece because there is lots of research out there that shows that independent directors have not added value at all to the enterprises for which they are responsible. And I look at that and sort of say, well, why are we even asking that question? Because the existence of independent directors is not about improving the economic results of the corporation. Independent directors became a vogue again in the 1970s in the face of the wave of hostile takeovers that were going on in the United States, fueled by the financing power of Michael Milken, who was with my former employer, Drexel Burnham. And the courts found that they would allow hostile takeover defense mechanisms, such as the poison pill, to stand if they had been adopted by independent directors through a careful decision-making process. Now, embedded in that concept is the idea that independent directors have nothing at stake in the transaction, and they are the only people in a position to come to a valued opinion because they are detached from the result. And so the basic argument for independent directors, which have become a vogue all over the globe, and I think something like 95% of boards in this country, in the US, have a super majority of independent directors. The idea is simple. The independent director exists because management cannot supervise itself. So that gets us to the next one, which is that the CEO reports to the shareholders. No, 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 no. The CEO reports to the board. The board evaluates the CEO and determines his compensation or her compensation. And usually a public company has to describe the basis for that calculation, but it's very important that the board exist between the CEO and the shareholders as the people in a position to actually evaluate what the CEO is doing. Okay, number 6, shareholders give direction to the board. This is a really interesting one. In 1906, in a court decision in the UK, again, there was a surprise decision where the court determined that the board powers are established in the company's formation documents. So in those documents, the rights of the shareholders are laid out, and they're typically to elect the board of directors. And there may be a requirement that a supermajority approve any changes to the bylaws and so on. But basically, shareholders have very little control beyond their ability to vote periodically on the corporation's slate of directors. What the court was saying there was, look, those bylaws and incorporation documents are in effect a contract with the directors. You, the shareholders, have given them the right to run the company, except in those instances where you've reserved the rights in the corporation documents. So that was a surprise ruling at the time, but it actually makes a lot of sense. Okay, here's another favorite of mine. Directors should not communicate with investors. I have sat in so many boardrooms in which the sense of outrage, the question I ask about, okay, when does the board hear from the shareholders as to what's on their minds? Oh, Lord, you can't do that. I mean, we've got insider information issues. We've got all these issues. No, 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 that would be confusing to the shareholders. No, 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 no. And that traces its roots to the fact that in the 1950s, General Electric started the first shareholder relations department inside the corporation to deal with all of the noise that shareholders were making. And the precedent that was set by that as having the communications with shareholders go on inside, from inside the company was followed for a very long time. However, it's a design issue in that we want to know, as the board of directors, what's on the mind of shareholders. Not to say that we are taking direction from them, because we know a lot more about the company in most cases than they do. So we need to be willing to substitute our own independent judgment when they're telling us what they think. But nevertheless, having the ability to hear what they think is quite important. We don't want only management to know. Okay, the final one. Culture is the province of management, not the board. I have heard that so many times of late in this period of time in which corporate culture is getting a great deal of attention. And the truth is, nothing could be further from the truth. The board embodies the corporate culture. People follow what their leaders do, not what they say. So if the board is attentive to corporate culture, if the board does things like pays attention to allegations of improper sexual behavior, pays attention to environmental concerns, pays attention to employee issues and so on, and is seen to be doing so, that has more effect on corporate culture than any amount of handbooks and value statements and so on and so forth. As the board does, so do all the others. So those are some of my arguments. And
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead, Deborah.
To me, the question that directors as a group really need to focus on and resolve the question of who owns the public company and how its wealth is to be directed. because that is what's going to determine our ability collectively as citizens of the world to build a sustainable future.
Excellent. Deborah, very, very thought-provoking, I have to say, and it's very interesting also to hear your views on, let's say, the dynamics in and around the boardroom. Obviously, the work that we do, working on the leadership front and working with a lot of both private and public organizations of different sizes. Of course, it shows us over and over again that it's always around, let's say, the relationships, the communication between the various parties, the competencies, the decision-making processes and bodies, etc., which often lead to failure or even success of various organizations. And of course, we've gone through our own experience, as I mentioned, going through the management buyout and the dynamics and the decision-making bodies that has incorporated for us as an organization as well. So very, very thought-provoking and very interesting to hear your thoughts on that, Deborah.
Well, you know, you mentioned SpenglerFox and the work that SpenglerFox does, and that reminds me to say something else, which is that you and I, Jens, have no commercial relationship. I have no tie to SpenglerFox, other than the tie that has developed as I have spoken with many of your principals around the globe. And I have found that your team represents what seems to me to be the kind of approach I would like to see taken in the boardroom, which is that to a man, woman, and child, you are very thoughtful people, not cookie cutter people by any means. You're from all different cultures. You're very thoughtful people, however, who are bringing your best thoughts to the building of your business. And that means that those best thoughts are involved in evaluating the people that you're talking with as candidates for the jobs that you're filling. You're doing this from a judgment-based perspective, from a qualitative perspective, and not from the quantitative perspective that so many other search firms are following. So I think it's really worth pointing out the parallel that the artisanal approach, if you will, the idea of a craftsperson building something to last for the millennium, is what we're going for as corporate directors. And it is what I actually believe SpenglerFox embodies very, very well.
Well, thank you so much, Deborah, for the praise. And as you mentioned, we have no let's say, financial ties at this point. So it's all the nicer to hear that from you. And thank you for sharing your experience with us on that part as well. Deborah, I'm a little bit conscious of time, and also our promise to open up the session to a Q&A if there's any questions that, let's say, the greater audience has in this context. I'm sure there's hundreds, obviously, of interesting aspects to discuss in great detail. Also, we'll be, of course, sharing the documentation, and Deborah, you can be sharing, let's say, some links, and also let's say an offer to communicate directly with you through email or other means, which we will be publishing and sharing with the community. So there will be more opportunity to obviously go into detail on various fronts, but maybe we can open up now to any questions that the audience may have.
Okay, thank you, Jens. I have a question, if you don't mind, Deborah, whilst we wait for Eva. I manage a transition here, a transitions program at SpenglerFox, and I often engage in conversations where people are interested in perhaps pursuing a career as a non-executive director, for example. What advice would you give someone looking to seek in their first board seat? What would be some areas that, or perhaps some points they should look out for when considering accepting a position on the board?
Well, your perspective on that, Alice and Jens, is probably better than mine, because you look across many different constituencies of both candidates and companies looking to fill those roles. My perspective is that what we're looking to do here is build trust and sustain trust. So I have had the unusual experience of serving on, I don't know, more than 24 different boards. But every single one, no, maybe that's not true. There may have been a couple that were not that way. But in the great majority of cases, I was appointed or elected because I was trusted by the parties around the table. And so I would suggest for those people that are seeking the opportunity to look to the people that you already know, to attorneys, to colleagues that are involved in board work, to advisors and consultants and so on, because often that middleman can play a really important role in helping the board make decisions about whom to bring on. So look to the people you already know who already trust you as the first line of approach in terms of finding board roles. Then once you are potentially invited to serve, don't forget to do considerable due diligence on the situation, and not just on the financial status of the company, but look at the board at the way it makes decisions. And this is fair game to ask the board, to ask the chairman, to ask the nominating and corporate governance chairman, to ask the individual board members that you're meeting. And I would say there's actually another little piece to that, because as the vogue supporting independent directors has become so pronounced, so has also the selection process that does not involve the CEO. The effort is to correct for the fact that the CEO in the past had perhaps too significant an influence on the choices of who's in the boardroom. But do not make the mistake of not meeting with the CEO. You must meet with the CEO as part of your due diligence, because if that connection is not there, you have a hard time being an effective director.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Your advice will be much appreciated by all. We have another question that's been written in by Victor, who asks, in your opinion, Deborah, which functional expertise is most needed in boards, for example, in marketing, finance, sales, and would this depend on a type of company, its stage in growth?
Oh, that is a massive question, and I hope I won't offend anybody if I come out a little bit against the skills matrix, in that while it makes absolute sense for a board to be balancing the mix of skills that it has represented in the boardroom, that skills matrix that so many boards use now, and increasingly investors are asking them to disclose, can become a tyranny in itself in two ways. It can, in fact, fragment the board. That's one of the ways. And the other way is that it can sort of ossify those silos, in that I have actually served on a board in which the chairman of the audit committee was an accounting professor. He was a perfectly intelligent, capable, established professional man. However, he believed that he was not to have an opinion about anything other than accounting. So you can see how dangerous that is, because once you cross the line and become a fiduciary for the company, you are responsible for the whole thing. You have no individual power. Your power is only to act as a member of the group, but every member of that group is responsible for 100% of the operation. You can't draw lines and say, I only think about accounting. So I suppose you've hit, Victor, on one of my pet peeves. Now, when it comes to the actual expertise, I think the coda to your question is a good one, in that a lot of things depend on the life cycle stage of the company and on the industry. However, I believe that most boards really want, or should want, wisdom. What they want is people who have taken on major challenges, managed their way through those challenges, developed a degree of self-reliance, perhaps managed in several different environments, whether they be geographic environments or industry environments, so that they have a cross-section of skills. But what you want is people that have independent judgment and that are willing to challenge management in as constructive a way as possible. So I would put a premium on those kinds of skills, believing that such things as marketing, cyber security expertise, those are sets of expertise that shift a good deal, and therefore the company may be better served by hiring those skills than by putting those skills on the board.
Excellent, thank you very much. I'm going to try Eva once more. I'm a bit conscious of time, but let's see if we can get a better connection here. Eva, your line's unmuted.
Yeah, for some reason it shows Eva, but it's Cedric actually.
Okay.
Hello, Deborah. Cedric, colleague from the Middle East in Dubai. Should we talk about remuneration or a reward of a board, and maybe more generally, how do you see that topic?
Cedric, another minefield that's very interesting. Having been immersed in this endeavor for the last 18 months or so, I have spent a good deal of time in the crazy arena of the definition of independence. And interestingly, there are as many people or as many constituencies who believe that, for example, paying directors in shares undermines their independence, as there are people who believe that paying directors in shares incentivizes directors to make good decisions. So people are all over the map about the compensation or the components of the compensation. I have served in a particular public company board environment with a guy who was a professor and who really didn't make any money, and therefore the board fees he got from the company enabled him to drive around in a Mercedes-Benz. So in my mind, the importance of the compensation is that it needs to reflect the fact that directors are asked increasingly to shoulder a significant professional burden. So the compensation must be respectful of that commitment of time and effort. On the other hand, the compensation needs to be looked at in the context of both the company's resources and the individual director's resources. I mean, it's an amazing way to compromise somebody's independent judgment to give him enough money that he can buy a Mercedes-Benz and other luxuries that he could never have on his own salary. So it's important to watch out for the, again, the qualitative pressures, the implicit pressures that the compensation package may bring. I do believe that some directors are wildly overpaid, but generally not all that many. Mostly the board compensation is not terribly significant. So it requires a peculiar person who's willing to take on burden in exchange for what is almost inevitably less money than they would get from pursuing their own professional capacities. I don't know, Cedric, if that answered your question. It certainly raised some issues to think about.
Yeah, thanks a lot. But so you're saying that it should be more like a remuneration rather than a rewards based on performance, right? It might be both.
That's a lovely distinction. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with rewards, but we live in a world that, you know, increasingly emphasizes rewards rather than professional commitment in exchange for remuneration and a sense of gratification from doing the job. So again, I'm looking at SpenglerFox as an example of the artisan who is doing a bespoke job at whatever they're doing and earning enough money for having done that, as opposed to trying to get maximum dollars for the doing of it. Because trying to get maximum dollars for the doing of the job distorts the actual conducting of the job, if you understand what I mean. Jens, do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, absolutely, Deborah. Absolutely. I'm sure it's clear to the community.
Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you, Cedric. I'm delighted to talk to someone who's in Dubai.
You'll have to come visit us one day, Deborah.
My location in Mississippi must seem just as exotic to you as Dubai does to me.
Well, though it's a very subjective concept. I'm sure it's extremely exotic over there. But you're welcome anytime in the Middle East.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And the concept of governance and boards in a region which is driven by family groups more than multinational is extremely important.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating, isn't it? I've been spending time recently as a director of 2 family-owned companies, and I ran into the CEO of one of them told me a story the other day about they're very proud of the fact that they are on their they're bringing generation 4 into the mix, but the CEO knows a guy from Indonesia who is in either generation 500 to 600, somewhere in there, that this is a shipping company and a trading company that believes that its 3 wise men were the men who delivered the frankincense and myrrh to baby Jesus. That gives some perspective on the legacy of family companies.
Excellent. Thank you, Cedric. Alice, is there any more questions?
We can try Eva once more. The other Eva, not Cedric. Eva, can you hear us, or can you say something? Otherwise, I think there could be audio problems there. But I have a question written in from Peter in Germany. I'll read this out. It says, as you mentioned, you have been thinking of writing a book since the early 1990s. How did your perspective change post the 2008 financial crisis? Did it change any of your myths, and did it expose any new myths?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and it makes me think, Peter, that you would actually enjoy reading this book. Because I have an unusual background in that I arrived on the scene in Manhattan with my freshly minted Wharton MBA in 1980 and went to work for a bank, and while there became one of the early members of the interest rate swap market, now known, of course, as the derivatives market. And I took that expertise with me to Drexel Burnham and started that function over there. And as we moved through the 1980s, we did the first CMO, collateralized mortgage obligation, in 1984 with $1 billion of Freddie Mac collateral. And each of these developments was designed to solve a specific client problem. In other words, many institutional investors could not buy mortgage-related product because of the uncertainty of the return associated with the fact that mortgages generally have a right to prepay at any given time. So in developing the CMO, which structured the payment streams in terms of slow, medium, and fast, a new market was opened up where institutional buyers could buy the stuff. So each of these, quote, innovations in the 1980s was an answer to a specific problem. But the way Wall Street works, the way the world works, is that once you've done it once, you do it forever, as long as you can extract fees from it. That's just the nature of a free trading market. So as I fast forward, in the 1990s, I was the emergency, as in the last, the big sucker, who was the CEO of the oldest and largest subprime mortgage origination and servicing company in the US. And because in the immediate period after the 1998 Russian debt crisis and so on, liquidity left the market. Fortunately, to my mind, a number of these subprime originators died because they're cash flow negative business models, and they can only exist when they can declare the earnings from their sales of loan portfolios. I had a front row seat then to the creation of these structures, and then serving as the CEO of this company and essentially taking it apart and putting it out of its misery. I got a chance to see the excesses. I looked at lots of loan collateral that was houses with 3 walls. I signed lots of papers to remove cubic yards of canine fecal matter. In other words, lots of collateral that didn't really exist had been stuffed into these vehicles. So moving forward, I thought that by the end of the 90s, we had pretty much stamped out the subprime market. But then certain US policies about trying to get housing finance to the least fortunate among us had the effect of bringing back that mandate to lend to those who really didn't have the ability to repay the loans. So, and then after 2001, and we had the great disaster of 9/11, there was a strong US policy initiative to keep interest rates low. So what happens then in the capital markets? More and more collateral that is very suspect is getting originated and put into securitized vehicles. And that ends up then creating the collateralized debt obligation, the collateralized loan obligation, and then we end up seeing the collateralized debt obligation made up of collateralized debt obligations, which were known as CDO squared. So at some point in here in the early 2000s, it was impossible for any individual person to understand what was actually in these vehicles. So to me, we did ourselves in with the perfect storm that came about in 2008. And I wish that we had learned the lessons as people around the world better from 2008. In that now it's my belief that while we have a world that still exists, it's a weaker world in that we have depleted a good many of our reserves trying to hold the global system together. And we succeeded, and presumably we will rebuild those reserves. But I don't know that we have actually learned the lessons that related to the momentum that pushed us over the brink. The momentum being the stuffing of unappetizing collateral into unsuspecting vehicles and handing it off to ignorant investors who really didn't know what they were buying. I think we are vulnerable to that still today, not on as massive a scale, perhaps, I hope, but we are vulnerable. That's another reason why getting governance right is really important. The board of directors, and I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm going over time here, I'm sorry, Jens, but one thing I listened to people say when they had been directors of the big financial companies in 2008, and I heard them say over and over again, you know, of course, we don't know anything about derivatives, so how could we be expected to know what was going on inside these vehicles and so on? And I would stand up and say, now wait just a second here. You can ask. You can ask why the change in the balance sheet from one quarter to another. And another thing, if Merrill Lynch, for example, was known for one thing, what was it? It was its ability as a retail juggernaut to sell paper. Okay, so if you're a director of Merrill Lynch, what do you need to watch out for? You need to watch out for the abuse of that channel, of that ability to sell that paper. That would be a really important preoccupation of yours. If you are a director of Goldman Sachs, what's Goldman Sachs's reputation? But their reputation is that they are a trading juggernaut, that they know a lot about managing risk. Okay, so the director there has got to be thinking about, all right, how do I know what kinds of risks these traders are running? And what kinds of controls do we have upon them? It seems to me just so obvious from a common sense perspective that if you're sitting there as a director of one of these companies, you ask the questions that are about the thing that created the company's reputation. Not knowing anything about derivatives is absolutely no excuse.
Dear Deborah, thank you so much. I think I'm just, again, conscious of time. We're up to the hour now, and I'm sure we could go on for another couple of hours. As you've spoken, Deborah, I've already got a couple of prompts on various channels asking me to connect them with you, which I'll gladly do, both internally and externally. So I'll definitely do that right after this call. But again, we may still have some questions open, but there will be some opportunity after. I can only thank you very, very much, Deborah, on behalf of SpenglerFox, the SpenglerFox Group, our community, for sharing the experience with us today, giving us a taster of the content of your great work and also the thought-provoking advice that you've provided. And what should I say? Wishing you all the best for your book, and I just can't wait for the governance revolution in action. So book number 2. So please do keep us updated on the progress there.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been really fun. And of course, I would love to hear from anybody who has opinions or disagrees with me or, you know, wants to learn more. My thought is that I don't need to be right in these comments. What I'm aiming to do is to get people thinking. And, you know, disagreeing is just as fine as agreeing if it means that people are thinking.
Absolutely, and you'll get both, Deborah. I'm sure you have in the past, and you will in the future. But it makes it all the merrier. So thank you so much for your time, Deborah. All the very best, and stay in touch.
Thank you, Jens and Alice, and Cedric, and everyone else.
Thank you very much, and bye-bye. Talk to you next time.